This is Mike Tatarski, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. It's good to be back after a few weeks off. I also write the Vietnam Weekly newsletter for listeners who may not know, which you can find at vietnamweekly.substack.com. Vietnam is widely known as a major producer of clothing. Go to any apparel retailer around the world, and many of the labels will say Made in Vietnam. Most of the fabric that this clothing starts as, however, still comes from China. Despite Vietnam's significant manufacturing expansion in recent years, that part of the supply chain has not moved, and probably never will, or at least not anytime soon. This is just one example of China's influence over the fashion industry in Vietnam and Southeast Asia more broadly. This presence, as is the case in so many sectors, isn't surprising given China's proximity, economic might, and population size, as well as historical ties with the region. How does that influence interact with fashion creation and production in Southeast Asia's fast-growing economies, where designers and consumers, whether in Malaysia, Indonesia, or Vietnam, now seek products with distinct cultural touches? This is just one of the big-picture questions pursued by today's guest. Wesley Ling is a professor of transcultural arts and design at London Metropolitan University and director of the Center for Creative Arts, Cultures, and Engagement, or CREATURE for short. Her research traditionally focused on what she calls fashion making in China, but she has since expanded her fieldwork to Southeast Asia while exploring the many linkages between these two locations in this area. We discuss China's influence on fashion making in Southeast Asia, from the fabric supply chain through design and sales, how fashion designers in the region feel about this influence and how these sentiments vary by country, steps Vietnamese designers are taking to highlight Vietnamese characteristics in fashion, and much more. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest ideas, get in touch at matatarski@gmail.com. Let's get to my conversation with Wesley. Wesley, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Sure. So I did a brief intro that our listeners have already heard of who you are and what you do, but I think it would probably be better if you kind of described a bit yourself, what you research and what you focus on.
Sure. Currently I am a professor of transcultural arts and design at London Metropolitan University. I direct a research center called CREATURE, which stands for Research Center for Creative Arts, Cultures, and Engagement. So this is my main job, and as an academic researcher, my research focus is on fashion. We call it fashion making. It's a specific term, really looking at all aspects of fashion making, including design, creation, ideation, production, and that also link on to manufacturing and supply chain. So my focus is on fashion design and their aspects of design and fashion from their perspective. So I usually focus on the geographic region of China and recently expand onto Southeast Asia, primarily looking at China connection with Southeast Asia in relation to their fashion making.
Perfect. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, you were brought to my attention by a mutual friend at a university here, because I understand you've spoke at an event here in Ho Chi Minh City earlier this year. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. That was a conference on social sciences and innovation, and that was hosted in Trung Duc Thanh University over the summer. So I was honored to deliver a keynote for the conference. So I think that's the contact that came from.
Yeah, exactly. And so obviously, Vietnam is in the title of this podcast, so that is the focal point, but I do like to, broaden that aperture from time to time as well, as listeners will know. And China is certainly highly relevant to Vietnam for many reasons, including its connections with the fashion supply chain and other topics that you just mentioned briefly. So how did you kind of decide to explore China's influence on what you call fashion making in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I think it started really with a book called Fashion in Multiple Chinas. That was 2018. And in the book, we explored the complexities and diversities within Chinese fashion across various regions and cultural contexts. We particularly analyzed the shifting definitions of Chinese fashion, and we examined how globalization, politics, and regional identity influence style, design, and cultural practices in China. In particular, we argue the fact that Chinese fashion cannot be understood as a single entity, and instead it reflects the mosaic of cultural, political, and economic factors that shaped how fashion is produced, consumed, and even perceived, both within China and internationally. So really starting at that point, then we are interested in the influence of historical traditions and modern innovations. And in the context of China, we trace how its rapid modernization had transformed its fashion industry from a state-controlled production to a globalized market with a very unique blend of heritage and trend-focused design. And in the book, we make a lot of case studies through which we illustrate the multi-layered nature of fashion in China. And also, we highlighted the ways in which it interviews with regional identities and globalized influences. And really, through this book, that we want to highlight the intersections of fashion, identity, and Chinese culture. So really from that point onwards, and the kind of mission that I was doing in terms of research is very much looking at these aspects of intersections of fashion, identity, and culture. And because my focus was on China previously, and so it's become natural for me to kind of spend on to Southeast Asia to look at the sort of rising power of China and then the influences to this part of the world.
Okay. And in what ways does this influence show kind of broadly and maybe more specifically within Vietnam?
Yeah, I think there is some similarity in related to the process of production. For example, these two countries, they operate in a dual process of symbolic and material production. So there are fashion design activities in both countries, but at the same time, these both countries also actively engage in the material production, say like their garment production basis for the rest of the world. And Vietnam is catching up quite a lot, especially after post-COVID time, and many factories are opening up and even moved from China. And so primarily now we can also see like Vietnam is a manufacturing country and really focusing on garment manufacturing. So this is actually quite interesting because when we compare these to Europe and somewhere like where I've based in Britain, garment manufacturing industry or even textile industry, they are already dead many decades ago. So the emphasis on fashion making is primarily on creativity and services industry like marketing and business operation. So production is necessary, has to be migrated elsewhere. But for countries where they manage to do both of these symbolic and material productions are not a lot, but primarily they are in Asia. Vietnam is one of those. And so that really caught my eyes to look at Vietnam as one of my case studies as well. So that is one point that really bring me to look at the influences of China in Vietnam. But at the same time, Vietnam's growing economy in the digital era also means it's increasing contact with the rest of the world. And these contact also brings in new insights to the operations of the Vietnam fashion system. It also enables designers to cross-fertilize their ideas with fellow designers across the world. The cultural and economic interchange between Vietnam and outside of Vietnam is a key component to the characteristic of Vietnamese fashion. So these digital platforms really increasingly help Vietnamese designers to gain exposure, in particularly of the proliferation of Facebook and Instagram, and because they are the very common platform and widely available to the majority of people. And similarly to fashion designers, they actively use this platform to promote, if not to market their product.
Yeah, and certainly Facebook and Instagram are huge here, which kind of brings to mind a quick question. I know those platforms are banned in China. So do designers or clothing, small clothing companies there, do they just do the same thing on WeChat or whatever the equivalents are in China? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, in China, there's firework. So the platform that we use in Europe, America won't be allowed in China. But at the same time, China developed their own platforms, which is equally powerful, if not effective in their own means. So certainly they use a lot of WeChat and they have their TikTok and they have even much bigger types of digital sort of platforms, Alibaba and sort of Tmall and all these really very gigantic digital platform that enables them to sell, market, and also consume fashioned merchandise across the country. They're pretty advanced in that sense. So even though we say like they are working behind the firewall, but at the same time, they also develop something kind of uniquely powerful for their own national consumption and national sort of demand.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, Temu is actually just recently launched here in Vietnam, and there's been a lot of concern about it recently in state media because, kind of it's already beating some of the local competition, for example. So Kind of getting more into your work. I mean, it's not just theoretical. You study individual designers and do field research with specific designers or on specific designers, both in China and Southeast Asia. How do you find designers to work with or study, and what perspectives to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, well, primarily I focus on designer fashion, which means that I'm particularly interested to those designers who are individual designers, though, so they may not be necessarily having a big backup or work with big corporations. So they own their own design labels. And I mean, usually designers like this, they sort of aspire to the sort of your American fashion system, because traditionally the individual designers or the kind of powerful brand were kind of developed and spring off an individual brand, and then they grow into an empire or perhaps like a big sort of conglomerate. But it started off from a very unique kind of person, has a lot of personality, driven the brand to become very unique and characteristic and express its own identity to their own followers. And these are the people that I am very interested in. And I think the reason that I've picked them is because fashion is a subject which affiliates so much with identities and individuality. So in many ways, those individuals who are inspired to meaning making are those that I'm particularly intrigued to. So when I was looking for informants, I usually go into these individuals and talk about their creation, talks about how they operate their enterprise, and also swim through these very often competitive fashion systems.
And what does that field work look like? I mean, I know you're based in the UK, but are you visiting their studios over here in Asia, or how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I usually prefer in-person encounter. I think it's very important. Also because, well, I know that a lot of researchers manage to do interviews through online platform during post-COVID time, but unfortunately didn't work for me because my field work necessarily engage with the individuals itself, and also about visiting their workshops, their studios, and also about textile workshops. I would also go to visit, and even factories as well. So these are things that which are you need to be seen in order to believe, and it's very important for me to be on site. And usually, if budget allowed, I would be there for about like 3 or more weeks. Then I not only meet the informants one time, but very often I also engage with their activities. I take part in their events. I'd also engage with the life with the locals, so to get to understand life in the field from ground up. So that's usually what I would do. So it's a little bit sort of more time consuming, but nonetheless, it's a very precious experience, not just about meeting the new people, but also getting me the necessary knowledge about local perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I know your research in Southeast Asia is more ongoing. How have you found fashion designers in the region feel about Chinese influence on the various aspects of fashion making? I mean, I know Chinese influence in the region can be contentious at times, depending on the topic. How about in this case?
That's a very good question, because it depends on where and who you ask. I mean, the answer could be very different. When I first began in my field work, I'd often ask the designers whether there's any Chinese influence in their collections or in their way of operations. And in many ways, they would say no. But once I dig deeper into that and say, where do you source your materials? Where do you get your fabrics for your creation? And then they say, aha, yes. Then they begin to tell me a lot of the stories. And I think we could not neglect the fact that China is producing 98% of textile to the rest of the world. So in many ways, even designers are very keen on developing their own fashion designs, uniquely exclusive to their own countries. They cannot neglect the fact that they need to source materials from China, even though it may not necessarily be going into China to buy it, but then it could be from a source in their own country. So that is one thing that is quite substantial. The other thing is also about an aspiration. There are designers that really aspire to Chinese fashion in the way that they can entice local support, particularly for the subject matter of fashion design. I mean, this is a lot of people will argue for the fact that fashion belongs to America because of these sort of preference of international brands and also luxury brands that primarily from Europe. And so there's a preference of having these sort of fashion coming from elsewhere, particularly from what they call the West. And so in Asia, it's very difficult for Asian designers to really come up with their own brand and also be an admiration from their own people. So it's a very difficult task, and they all know it. So for the fact that China managed to develop their own brands, and also many of their brands, they sell nationally. And people from China also buy their local brands. And that is something almost as an aspiration for a lot of designers, especially a lot of fashion professionals, especially those I was referring to, those who are working to organize Fashion Design Week, and they're in fashion council. So they're constantly looking at how they can learn from the China model for their own country. So that gives a lot of this sort of inspiration. And at the same time, obviously, you were talking about competition as well. So undoubtedly, China is a very big market for countries as small as like Singapore or maybe Cambodia or even like Vietnam. And there are some designers, they might be thinking about expanding to the China market, because then they could expand their consumer base, because selling within their own country would not be profitable enough. And so they have to think about elsewhere. And China is essentially a very big consumer market. And so that somehow is an inspiration for them to look into in terms of consumer base and how they can actually expand further. So there are multiple aspects about how fashion designers feel about Chinese influence. And I think, well, there are also aspects about anti-Chinese sentiment historically in some regions, and I think we can actually touch on it further down the line. But I think primarily for the operations of fashion, and that's how designers are thinking of primarily.
Okay. And yeah, I mean, focusing a bit more on Vietnam specifically. So we talked a bit a few weeks ago before this call, and you mentioned that some Vietnamese designers you've talked with kind of worry that Vietnamese characteristics in their designs or other people's designs may not shine through, kind of given China's cultural power, for lack of a better phrase. I guess maybe this could be especially relevant. But what are these Vietnamese designers doing to try to address that?
Yeah, that is something that I found it's almost like a highlight, especially I met up with Vietnamese designers, because very often the first thing they said about Vietnam is that, oh, it's a very small country. A lot of people didn't know about Vietnam, and they could not even spot it on the map, and people just mistaking them from China. So there's a sort of anxiety among the designers, or even about like fashion professionals when I speak to them. And so that is one of the sort of common sentiment that I feel when I was discussing operations of fashion with these people. And there are indeed some actions coming out from it. So a few years ago, the magazine, which is a French magazine, but they have these branch in Vietnam called L'Officiel, and they launched a campaign called Proudly Vietnam. And it is very much focused on 100% made in Vietnam fashion, including fashion design, accessories, and also photography. So they celebrated all these sort of fashion professionals who designed their own creations with a very distinctive Vietnamese character. So they particularly like to kind of accentuate these characteristics to make it known to the public. And that was very supported by the fashion professionals, because it's not just giving them an avenue to express their own creation, but also really looking at how they could search for their own identity. And that is very important among the Vietnamese fashion circle. So that is one thing about these campaign, which is sort of initiated by a magazine, even though it is a French magazine, but these initiatives is actually initiated from the Vietnamese correspondent in Vietnam. So it's not kind of directed by the French headquarters. So this is very much a local initiative. And I believe that they are still doing it on an annual basis in order to sort of cultivate these motivations in search of a fashion identity for Vietnam. And another very interesting sort of group of people that I met, they are very interested in Vietnamese embroidery. I would call as young enthusiasts. So they're obviously individuals. They may not even be working within the fashion industry, but they're just very interested in exploring Vietnamese embroidery through its history. And they may not even be having any embroidery background, but they've wanted to learn about the embroidery, and through which reimagined a Vietnamese history. So that also means that they will visit the French school that in colonial times that would teach embroidery for the Vietnamese people. And some of them even go on to auction houses in Europe in order to buy those vintage and the lesser known pieces of embroidery. And these are embroideries which, when they showed me, I was very astonished because those are the embroidery which obviously no one would actually buy it. It's in a very battered condition. So many of them have broken threads and lots of frills, and the pieces are not even in one. So they use their own money to collect it. They would even call themselves as collectors, but they are very young individuals who actually do that. But then when they come back with these embroidery, they try to trace the differences between Chinese and Vietnamese embroideries, and then to stitch it back their own history, to learn from it. And I find it absolutely fascinating with these sort of practice, and I never come across it in other parts of Southeast Asia.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. I had no idea about that. I guess it's not perhaps surprising that Vietnamese designers may feel particularly strongly about Chinese presence or influence. I mean, I think Vietnam has, certainly within mainland Southeast Asia, the most contentious relationship with China. I mean, this obviously goes back many, many centuries. There is an ethnic community of Chinese here, but I think it's been subsumed a little bit more into broader Vietnamese culture, whatever that may be. Whereas, countries like Malaysia, for example, have very strong, distinct ethnic Chinese communities. What do you see in, places like Malaysia or other parts of Southeast Asia in this regard?
I think there are always contentions between different regions, especially when we talk about Southeast Asia. I have to refer to Indonesia because I actually just came back from Indonesia for the fieldwork over summer, and that really impressed me. Indonesia is a multicultural a multi-ethnic sort of countries, and depending on who you ask, you have very different answers. And certainly, my subject matter is China connection, and knowing that there's a history of anti-Chinese sentiment, and that is a very sensitive issue. And I was always very careful with who and how I'm going to address this question. And again, depending on who you ask, and you have different answers. When I was asking the Javanese whether these anti-Chinese sentiment is still looming large, or are there any remains? And they would tell me that, no, these are already history and no longer operate like these. And I think particularly in regions like in Jakarta, and obviously is a capital. And so there's an emphasis of modernization and also really catching up with the economy. So they kind of leave history behind it. And so the younger generations may not see that as such a matter. However, that is not entirely true, because the same generations, if they are Chinese descent in Java, they will still tell you about lots of kind of restrictions and regulations that is restricted their mobility as a sort of Chinese descent citizen, even though they were born and bred in Indonesia. So I met up with a few fashion and textile designers in Indonesia, particularly in the regions of Java, then thinking about these aspects of Chinese influences. The first thing they were told me is about the anti-Chinese sentiment, that they felt like they have been affected by it, even since a young age. So they would be experiencing it at school, and obviously they would be called names, and you can imagine that must be bullying along the way. So their upbringing is very different, and therefore that also affects the way that they see the world. And when I asked them whether that's impact on their textile design or fashion design, because that is not very obvious that you can actually see it in a creation,
right,
they say not necessarily, because it might not be the fact that you can put out a word or through the kind of materials that you can express this, or perhaps it is nothing to do with business. But then further down the line, they will show me other practices, which is also very inspiring. So along the line of their fashion business, they also take part in exhibitions, artistic expression through textile or fashion. So there are works where they make use of textile, and that could be a dress or whatever, that actually express this frustration that they've come across in related to that Chinese sentiment that they grew up with. So that seemingly is a very important element in their own creative process, whether they are actually expressing fully in their business operation or not. So that is one kind of the example of it. And if you think about in Vietnam, and obviously there's a very interesting case in Vietnam, and I think there's still people will refer to it, and that is this silk company. They sell silk scarf called Kai Silk. You probably heard about it because it's a very kind of reputable Vietnamese silk brand in the country, and many people just go there as a household brand. But some years ago, they were selling silk scarf but carrying the label of made in China. So there were these sort of incidents where they were accused of selling the source made in China silk scarf, but sell it as made in Vietnam product. So that has been sort of gone onto the news. And there are also a lot of people are very upset about it. And obviously that would affect the brand image, and a lot of people lost trust in the brand. These examples, I didn't really find out myself because the designers told me when I was doing my fieldwork. And essentially means that the designer also take notice of sensitivity between made in China and made in Vietnam. And especially in Vietnam, when there are all these manufacturing bases where most of the designers are making their collections in Vietnam, they know that they could not neglect the fact that they could not call it 100% made in Vietnam, because materials and textile, most are from China. And there are even materials, even like they're talking about a thread picker or maybe some sort of like elastic. These are things perhaps because Vietnam did not produce enough textile. At the same time, many of those accessories are primarily produced in China because they already established an infrastructure and producing these sort of like little materials to the rest of the world. So undoubtedly, there are lots of things actually coming from China. So when I talk to designers, fashion designers about these matter, about how they can ensure or be proudly call their collections made in Vietnam, and it's often a very difficult task for them to sort of declare. And they clearly notice that it's a sort of dilemma that they have to live through.
Yeah, and on that note, I mean, where do you see these trends kind of going in the future? I mean, as you said, I assume, some items will just never be made in Vietnam or maybe Thailand, for example, not due to lack of skill or anything, just the economics don't make sense compared to China, even with all of the manufacturing moving here. But from an economic sense, I mean, China right now is a little bit stagnant. I mean, it's still growing, but not like it used to, whereas Vietnam and some other countries are seen as very much up and coming. So where do you see this kind of influence going? I know we can't predict the future here, but in the future, where do you see it going?
Yeah, I think, well, there's obviously, we all understood that China's economy is actually slowing down and we don't know which direction it's going to go for the moment. So that time will tell how it's going to go. But I think particularly for geopolitics is something that the word we can foresee in the future. And it's something that probably all of these Southeast Asia countries cannot neglect it. At one point, I mean, there are multiple kind of sentiments on the ground up, depending on which regions and who you speak to in related to the fashion operations. But at the same time, for supply chain and production, we cannot neglect the fact that China still holds sway. Because even though we're talking about many countries now, they're trying to move their factories elsewhere, and we cannot neglect the fact that many of these factories may as well of Chinese owned, even if they move elsewhere. So even in Vietnam, we're talking about made in Vietnam, but primarily many of these garment factories are actually of Chinese entity. So this trend will still going because of Chinese economy. And also we are talking about American election coming up and whether the sort of tax and quota would increase imposed on China, and that would put a very strong sort of influence in moving Chinese businesses as well as factories elsewhere. But whether they are entirely moving out or it's just a moving house is another matter. So I think these supply chains productions is always going to be a huge sort of relationship with Southeast Asia designers. But at the same time, also about market expansion and consumer base. So although Chinese economy is slowing down, but we're still talking about Chinese market as a huge consumer market. And we also understood that Southeast Asia designers, even though they're designer brand, but their price range and market segments are not the same as luxury brands as in Euro America. So their price range might as well be fairly favorable in China market. So for the sake of a population and consumer base, it is still a lucrative market for many designers. So perhaps not all of them will be aspire to expand in China, but then small amount of them will still be thinking about how they can actually sell and expand their market, especially if you're somewhere in China. And another aspect is about design inspiration and cultural exchange. So these are things where designers always look up to. So even for China, there are lots of trends. Early on mentioned about the many sort of digital platforms where Chinese is created for their local consumers and for national use. And they also manifest many different kinds of national trends, which is quite unique to their own country and to the local aesthetic. And these are something where Southeast Asia countries are taking inspiration from. Particularly fashion is intrinsically linked to identities. So even when we talk about market expansion, designers are not solely bringing up some sort of Chinese-inspired designs to appeal to the Chinese market, but they necessarily need to express their own unique identity, incorporating their own traditions into their own design. And so in this respect, the way how China could succeed to entice their own locals are somewhere that the Southeast Asia designers would be looking very closely into. And the other things about digital platform and e-commerce, which you also mentioned earlier on, is that the good things about Southeast Asia countries is that, well, there is no firework, at least for now.
Right.
And so the expansion of the collections through Facebook and also Instagram are actually very, very international. So there are a lot of exchanges from Southeast Asia regions with other sort of global brands, and there's a lot of mutual learning from each other. And that subsequently shaped the ideation, creation, and operations of Southeast Asia designers. Especially there are really just an emerging profession in this digital era. So we are seeing a very different kind of generations operating fashion in their own way, which is very unique from those who are emerging in 20th century.
Okay. And that kind of brought to mind one final question. I mean, we've been talking a lot about China, which is, of course, a huge force. Also don't want to overstate its presence in Southeast Asia. I mean, do you see much cross-pollination between, Vietnamese designers and Malaysian or Thai, for example? I mean, I know these are very distinct cultures and countries despite their proximity, but do you see anything like that happening or even in its early stages?
Yeah, well, definitely there is a lot of collaboration, not simply about designers expanding their market elsewhere in other Asian regions, but also about collaborations. And particularly, we're talking about Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. So there's a very big Muslim population, and we're talking about a very unique kinds of fashions that they have to create. And many of these traditional clothing are also worn in contemporary times, and they are revitalized by many sort of new and young generations of designers. You can see that there's a lot of cross-fertilization among these designers in terms of creation, but as well as production, particularly talking about Singapore being a very sort of advanced economy compared to the rest of Southeast Asia, and their labor costs will be much higher than other Southeast Asia. So you can see a lot of designers are actually taking their production elsewhere for manufacturing. And for those who are working on traditional clothing like a kabaya or maybe like batik, they took their productions to Indonesia because production cost is much cheaper. And there's still the tradition of making batik at a much lower price. And so you can see some of these designers actually taking up batik maker in other countries, but at the same time also educating these maker with contemporary aspiration and making batik in a new way to appeal to contemporary consumers. So there are undoubtedly some sort of cross-fertilization across very different countries. And obviously we're talking also about like in Malaysia and Indonesia, there's a huge sort of tailor-made economy. So many people are still having their tailors following them, especially they will make their new clothes for their festival, especially for the Muslim festival. So there's a very huge kind of tailor economy on the ground. And there are many Malaysians even took the plane to Indonesia and to make their clothes in Indonesia because it's cheaper, and so they can also source materials much more readily. And then they made it all throughout the whole wardrobe and then flew back to Malaysia just in time for the festival. So there were all these sort of activities going on the ground. So many cross-fertilization. So it would be very interesting to see how that would manifest in the future years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I've certainly seen, fashion designers here modernizing the ao dai, Vietnam's traditional, well, I suppose female dress, but the male version as well, which is very cool to see. Well, Wesley, thank you so much for taking time to talk to me today. Really fascinating topic, not something I had put much thought to before, to be honest, kind of beyond the supply chain factory aspect of it, but really fascinating stuff. And I look forward to learning more from your future research. So thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
That's it for this episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Connect with the Vietnam Weekly on Threads, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. Please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform, and see you next week.